On the LGBT topic, getting the conversation off the ground was incredibly difficult. Just getting rabbis to participate proved to be a fool's errand. I tried to do this in North America several times. I contacted many people, and nobody wanted to opt in. It's as if the very notion of talking about it, in the words of one person I spoke to, legitimized it. And I would argue it's not about legitimacy or illegitimacy. It's about discussing an issue that's very important today, both culturally and Jewishly, and trying to see, how does this work in Judaism? How does an ancient religion fit, accommodate, not accommodate contemporary modes of authenticity, gender identity, sexuality, etc.? But even having the conversation was like kryptonite for people, like plutonium, and they didn't want to have it. So just getting it off the ground is a bit of a morality tale about the very difficulty of having these kinds of conversations in the Jewish world today. So we had so much fun 3 weeks ago at the public event that we decided to all get together and speak some more about the issues. And the truth is that the issues are so complicated and public events are limited by time and other considerations that I definitely felt, and everybody here agreed with me, that it would be a good idea just to get together privately and try and hash over some of the issues that came up. None of us have seen the raw footage, but we each have memories of what took place. So I think that's why we're here. I, throughout the evening, had thoughts in my head about what I was hearing that I kind of made a mental note of early on and felt like it would be good to have a further conversation about these things. And of course, one of the things I had in my head had to do with something that you, Shlomo, talked about early in the evening. You actually raised a crucial issue, the issue of what is the intersection between morality and Judaism or religion, right? When you expressed a kind of telos, an ending that you think all of halakha or all of the Torah should end up at, and that is what you called asita yashar v'atov, to do what is right and good. And I asked you at the time, and I'm sort of still curious about it, to me this raises a central contradiction about religion, which is that if we say that we have a conception of the good that religion has to match, what does it mean when religion says something that seems to define itself as good or bad? My example, of course, being the prohibition that's stated in Vayikra about homosexuality, or homosexual sex. Isn't the very fact that the Torah says this is asur, that this is toeva, already telling you what you need to know about its idea of good? So is there an idea of good outside of this good?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's a crucial issue. That's the issue, because any dispute in the modern era about the position of women halachically and the position of the issues of kashrut or any social thing is about v'asita yashar v'atov. So actually, I'm not going to add more to this, but there is a dispute about the question whether v'asita yashar v'atov is the 614th mitzvah, or is it the summary of the sum of all the mitzvot by saying that this is the yashar v'tov. But I think that Chazal actually avoided this dispute and said that v'asita yashar v'atov is a way of commentary, because the Torah itself is law, is the spoken words of God to the people of Israel, and either it's Torah shebichtav or Torah shebe'al peh. And when Chazal are saying what exactly God said, or what are we want to say traditionally, or what do we want to commentate on the Torah, the way they approached it is by v'asita yashar v'atov as a way of commentary, because any pasuk we all know is a raw word. It's something that must be edited, something that must be understood. It's not, nothing is as is. There isn't even one pasuk in the Torah that you can take and apply to your life without, in any law, I think, not only the Torah, that you can take it and apply it to your life without commentary.
So let me just ask you, why do we assume that this verse is the overriding verse? This verse, do the good and the true or the right, is the one that guides all the others. How do I know it's not I'm the Lord your God, for instance. How do I know which is the frame?
Yeah, well, I'm not saying that's the only issue. But like the Kuzari and the Rambam, and I think most of the thinkers in the Middle Ages, and even until recently, said that this is one of the rules that you cannot overcome. Because obviously there is Avodat Hashem, and there is being loyal to the tradition and everything that we say, but eventually what the Kuzari says, that no mitzvah can be immoral. Because this is something which is the fundamentals of understanding the Torah. And then we say, okay, because Hashem wants us to be good and to have good life, and Hashem, and like any other law in Israel or in any place in the world, and obviously you cannot say that the words of God are less logic or less moral than humankind rules. So when I'm trying to see the issues of Shabbat, for example, so Chazal will say that pikuach nefesh doche Shabbat, because this is the depth of what Hashem wanted from Shabbat, and this is also the depth of what moral life is. So I'm not saying that life is above the mitzvot. I'm just saying what Chazal will say, that actually with your life you can do more mitzvot. So V'asita yashar v'atov means that without it you cannot worship Hashem. And then you say, okay, what do we do afterwards? On top of it, on top of the moral ground of this is the ground zero of everything. This is the fundamentals of it. But that's not the goal of the halacha. I'm not saying that's the goal to be yashar v'tov. Maybe it's to worship Hashem, and maybe it's to, I don't know, order and whatever it is. Depends which halacha it is, but still I want to build a society which is built up on moral values.
As much as I would like to agree with the prominence of that principle, I'm not sure that historically that was always the case. It was often the case, but there are certainly some thinkers and Baalei Halacha in the past who put, for example, the formal understanding of the pasuk as prominent, and if you can fit in the morality, so much the good, but not necessarily so. And certainly there are major things in the Torah, major directives, the prime example being Akedat Yitzchak, which seems to go against the Tov v'Yashar. So I don't think it's all that simple. I think it's a reading, one possible reason, perhaps even the main reading, but not the only reading.
And is it a main reading precisely because we're moderns? In other words,
No.
modern people seem uncomfortable with the straight binary of good and bad that the Torah outlines, especially in things that they feel uncomfortable about. So do we do this maneuver now in modernity?
I think perhaps we do it more, but certainly in the past as well, there were expressed feelings of dissonance, which Baalei Halacha and Baalei Machshava tried to overcome. I don't think it's new to modernity. Perhaps it's more prevalent in modernity.
The dissonance they expressed, though, was it more within the tradition? In other words, they attempted to reconcile something they were uncomfortable with by creating a maneuver, a strategic maneuver, an interpretive maneuver that said, we can overcome this, or we can even negate this. We can get rid of this. But we're going to do it with methodologies that seem traditional.
I think
Always.
even Rav Shlomo wants to do it
Right.
with the traditional methodology.
Right. Do you think those methodologies can be applied to the topic at hand? In other words, that's the big issue. Can LGBT be maneuvered in that way?
Yes, I think that what is a sensible maneuver and what is not is very much dictated by the surroundings and the circumstances. That is, in our particular context, a certain maneuver, which in the past might have been regarded as wild, becomes more and more reasonable given the conditions and the context.
Can you give me an example of such a maneuver?
As I mentioned last time, the maneuver of distinguishing between Isur D'Oraita and Isur D'Rabanan, and applying a particular meta-halachic principle such as Pikuach Nefesh, such as Kvod HaBriot, or other kinds of principles, which in the past may have been regarded as wild, become much more reasonable when you live in a reality that there are certain facts on the ground which make it look reasonable. I think also a prime example is the whole feminist revolution in religious society, where certain things appeared weird and totally without basis. And today, the women's vote, having a female prime minister, having women be doresh in Bet Knesset, all these appear more reasonable in particular contexts, so that the halachic support that is given for the new policy doesn't look as wild as it would have in an entirely different context.
So I want you all weigh in here. The devil here is in the details, right? Because you're talking about a relationship between baseline law and extra legal principles that you think are so important given a context or a time that they need to apply.
By the way, it's not only moral conditions, sometimes it's physical conditions.
Okay.
There are all kinds of reasons why the context may dictate something that appeared totally wild or unreasonable in a different situation.
So let's relist some of the things that you've all been talking about. You talked about pikuach nefesh, the idea that in a situation where life is at stake, where a person's life can be forfeit, some of the rules change to try and save that life. You talked about the difference between rabbinic laws and laws that date to the Bible. You talked about honoring...
The difference between Doraita and the Rabbanan is what allows you in this situation to use these. In other words, if you interpret everything that has to do with homosexual union to the Torah, am I okay?
You're more stuck.
You're more stuck,
You're
yes,
more
you
stuck.
don't.
And you talked about honoring the creations, right? Kavod habriot. What I really want to know, though, is that we could flip out a meta-legal principle all the time. And we could say, here's baseline law, but we've got this meta-legal principle honoring the creation, and we need to invoke it here. I think for many Jews, this is very confusing, because what they want to know is this just an authority contest? In other words, Amos Oz once said, the issue isn't who is a Jew, it's who is a rabbi. Meaning, who gets to filter the tradition for you? So is it really just literally come down to who decides that at any given time, including Lgbt, that we're going to invoke some meta-legal value as opposed to a legal value?
So I think it's not who is the authority. I think we have a basic game changer in the period that we are in today, in which the authority of the formal authorities is much less than it was in the past. And they can cry from now until tomorrow and say certain things are mutar, certain things are asur, but they don't carry the weight that they had in the past. And we can, if we want, look at it in a religious spirit and say this is also Ratzon Hashem, these new conditions. But I think that religious authorities today certainly are much more empowered by a community that exists and is willing to turn to them, whereas those who cry out in the dark and nobody listens to them just are powerless.
So, Yoni, here's what I want to ask you. We're talking here about the difference between top-down, ground-up, right? Do we talk about legal systems and the way people live as directives from above, politicians in the secular context, rabbinic figures in the religious context, and we say we live our life according to how they tell us we should live our life? The flip version is that law and Jewish life and practice get molded in a way, created by the fact that there's a groundswell of popular desire and opinion, and let's be really fair about it. Not from just any person who kind of is not committed to Jewish life, but people who are committed to Jewish life and have integrity and sincerity, but for them, there's been a kav, there's a line been drawn, and we want to do it differently. This is very confusing, right? We know that in very complex issues in the world, I don't want necessarily for law to be created by the majority of people That's why we have a Supreme Court, let's say. Now, whether you like or don't like the fact that 9 justices have a lot of power, but they may just be more empowered and more able to dissect the issue. So I want you to unpack for me a little bit the relationship between from above to below and below to above.
I think that question is very important because I think it's at the crux of a lot of what's being discussed over here. And I disagree with some of what was said, but I want to divide clearly between 2 different ways of looking at things. There's the practical and there's the principle. So in practice, I actually disagree with very little of what Professor Ross said just now, for example, that there is a loss of power and a loss of authority, and that a lot of stuff is being kind of like from the bottom up being decided. I'm not denying the reality that there is definitely a movement like that. Whether that movement is good or not good, and once again, Professor Ross is right, we can cry all we want about it, it'll still happen, but with all that said, I still think that there is certainly a good reason to discuss what should be. And in terms of what should be, I believe that in principle, things are a lot less malleable than is being presented here, from my perspective. So, for example, okay, I always say kind of like as what I want to say, like a case study, all right? I would use it as a case study. If someone said to me, can 10 women be part of a minyan? I would say, I'm not bothered by the result. I'm happy to embrace that result, assuming that the methodology used to get there is sound. Whereas my problem is not with 10 women being part of a minyan. The question is whether our tradition supports that. I'm not bothered by the result itself, okay? So if someone could prove it to me in tools that I think are methodologically sound, then I would say, yeah, there's definitely room for that, within our tradition. I have no problem with that specifically. But many times the tools that are being used are, in my mind, not methodologically sound from a halachic perspective. So for example, at the end of the panel, at the end, and you'll be able to correct me, I think it was from Arpilei Torah that Rabbi Greenberg was quoting. I think he quoted some passage from Arpilei Torah from Rabbi Kook. Right, so it was, right. I mean, I'm not versed with all of Rav Kook's halachic writings, but to the best of my knowledge, he did not use that principle in any practical sense. And to my mind, I think the principle being that we kind of like first do the action, and hopefully halacha will catch up with us. In other words, that we'll first, sometimes, things have to erupt in a way that is non-halachic, and then later on, a few generations later, the posik comes that finds the way to bridge the gap, in some way. That was the more or less, am I right? That's the passage?
Yeah, I wanted to, when he spoke, I wanted to qualify him. That passage is talking about Havara al Divrei Torah, and a Hora'at Sha'ah, which presumably is, how do you say Hora'at Sha'ah? Yeah, even though certain leeways or abrogations are allowed temporarily, we do know that temporary often becomes for a long, long time. Nevertheless, in principle, he is making a distinction there between Hora'at Sha'ah. Well, let's find a nice English word for it. A temporary ruling. On the other hand, he has so there are radical elements in that passage, but there are also conservative elements in the sense that he's limiting it to Hora'at Sha'ah. On the other hand, he has another passage where he talks about the Torah allowing slavery, and there he suggests that the Torah is really weaning us to a higher moral standard, but then also he qualifies, and so there theoretically we're allowed to change more because we're talking here about a more stringent morality rather than breaking a Torah principle. But even here he has certain qualifications. He says, when you have a convening of the Bet Din HaGadol, meaning the Sanhedrin, and you have outside circumstances that are forcing you or encouraging you to a new understanding of the Torah, and you have authorities who quite sincerely see a possibility for a new interpretation of the psukim in the Torah, then, of course, you understand that this was coming from God. In the meantime, when there is not this convening, and this perhaps could be applied to homosexuals, when these three factors have not yet beneficently been thrown together, then privately each person can, well, actually this doesn't apply to homosexuality. He's talking about a more refined morality. It depends how you understand a homosexual union. But then he says privately you can practice this higher morality, but don't try and spread it to the community as a whole before they're ready for it, because then it may have destructive results.
So that already is a more conservative reading of Rav Kook than Rav Greenberg, represented on the panel. I'm sorry, he's not here. I don't mean to, yeah. But okay.
Nevertheless, Rav Kook, as much you may want to reject or accept his view of things, but he has this Hegelian view of history, right, so that things that are happening on the ground, if they really take and settle and are accepted, then you know, if this is forced upon you, that this is Ratzon Hashem. So there's a direction that history is going to, and so things had to happen the way they do.
My point is only that it's Rav Kook is everyone knows he's a philosophical genius. He went beyond a lot of things that any of us thought that but from a halachic perspective, he's very conservative. In his halachic writings, he's very conservative. So I think that if someone said in his name, or used his authority in order to push for the acceptance of practices that went beyond what the verse allows, clearly, or what the halacha allows clearly, I don't think that he would agree at all. If I were, but I can't speak in his name, but I don't think that he would agree at all. His halacha bears absolutely no hint that he would accept such radical changes, even though his machshava certainly can be pointed in that direction. Which brings me to the last point, which is to say that if you want to change halacha in a clear way, I think that authority is part of the game. Once again, from a principle perspective, I'm not saying what happens in practice. I think in principle, yes, I think the halachists, meaning the people who are involved in mediating the halacha and in explaining the halacha and interpreting the halacha, I think that they are definitely a significant part of the game. And if people decide to do things on their own because they saw a passage in Rav Kook or a passage in Reb Tzadok Cohen of Lublin or a passage in Reb Nachman, et cetera, and they decide that suddenly this is okay and we can do this, okay, then they can do it. I'm not saying they won't do it. They'll do it. Is that right? Is that halachically correct? I don't think so. I don't think that it's a proper way to go about things. Halacha has its own rhythm, its own methodology, and we do need to keep to that.
Well, there's so much to say. First of all, I think that authority comes after the people. It's not only history, this is the way it used to be
Just clarify, you mean sequentially the people speak
the
and then
people
authority
speak,
follows?
Society speak, and eventually the poskim will follow reality, will follow people. This is how it used to be, and this is how it is. And authority, we need authority because there are different kinds of people, because people leave. And when they leave, we, like this group, for example, we are the mediators between life and halakha. Because the halakha, I'm trying to rule, but I will never say to any homosexual who will come to me that it's okay to be homosexual, to be gay. But I will say to carry out, to practice. But I will have compassion. I will explain. I will say, listen, there are ways that for you to keep halakha, and even if one halakha you cannot keep, I can't say that you're not a sinner. But it's between you and God, because I don't have any power. Lucky me that I don't have any power to enforce it on you. So this is the privilege that Jewish history gave us, that we don't have any power. So in a sense, all I have is education, moral values, and common sense. And in a sense, when I'm saying, okay, you can love Hashem, and if you think that Hashem loves you, it's fine with me. I don't have to give you degrees or to put you in a place where you don't want to be. It's okay with me that whatever you feel comfortable, and you really stand in front of God with your sins and with your behavior, and you take it as something that you think that is acceptable because God created you. God is not. We cannot reduce the will of God to halacha, and there's so many Gemarot and Midrashim about it that God is not only halacha, and even the Nevi'im say so. Okay, that God is way above halacha, and in a sense, if you live halachic life, and in one of the halachot you feel very uncomfortable and very immoral about it, so if you don't want to keep it, or it's very hard for you to keep it, it's not for me to unless I educate and I'm helping you to overcome it. But if you cannot, I can live with it.
Right. So wait, let me jump in here.
Just one more sentence about Rav Kook. I completely disagree with Rav Yoni and even with Professor Ross because, in a sense, because Rav Kook, even in the passage that Rabbi Greenberg mentioned in the 3 weeks ago, Rav Kook didn't say that the posek will overcome the halacha, will לעבור על דברי Torah. It's not the posek. Because the posek is anus. He cannot overcome דברי Torah. He cannot say, okay, let's reject something. So it's even better than הוראת שעה, than a temporary ruling, because what Rav Kook said eventually is that the people will push, and we as mediators will bring the voices into the world of halacha, and eventually the poskim will see that reality actually brings better life and better concept of law. And they will say, okay, this is the will of God, so it won't be a temporary ruling, it will be the ruling itself. So Rav Kook actually brings that even further by his system, by saying that actually the reality will dictate what is good and what is bad. And in my job, not Rav Kook's job, is to see what is right and good, and to bring the voice of good into the world of Torah, and to see what will happen. This is what we do here. This gathering is not to allow something. It's to talk about something. And when we bring the voices of the people into the Bet Midrash, each one of us in his own Bet Midrash, and we put it in the middle of the sugya, eventually the sugya will say, okay, I cannot accept it because it's wrong, because it doesn't bring what you think it brings, or this is not the spoken words of God. So it will come over and over again until the halacha will find ways to accept it. And not as in a temporary way, but this is for good, for eternity.
Okay, as Yaakov Katz, the religious sociologist and historian, said of the modern period, that the posek and the people, their relationship is like a blind man who points the direction to where he wants to go. This is the community. And the role of the posek is to give him the stick that will allow him to get there. In other words, to provide the methodology for where he wants to go.
You realize that we've all stepped into the minefield now, right? Because look at what just happened. We've talked about baseline law, then we've talked about meta-legal principles that allow for the law to be altered. Now you talked about the issue that at a certain point there's a kind of movement of history, right? A kind of, you want to call it providential, you want to call it Hegelian dialectic, it doesn't matter. The issue here is that if I say things are such that in modernity we've espoused certain values, freedom, equality, authenticity, recognition, I could go on. And these are the ways that people believe now, not shallowly, not facetiously, but with great passion and great conviction. And they believe on the basis of these principles that much of what passed for Jewish law and action violates these principles. What I want to know, I don't know if I can say clearly, is the relationship between saying that now that we've seen the way people want to act and what they believe in, that the law will now embrace this post facto and take it on. What's the difference between this and I will now rehearse somebody from my right who will say that's pure corruption. What you're doing is you're letting modernity, like a tidal wave, overrun, however you want to call it, Torah Tamiti, the true Torah, the true value. I'm trying to parse out the relationship here. How does the bottom up create what you want to call, whatever words you want to give it, the pure Torah, the correct Torah, the way to live? And what's the thin line between that and we're way off course and we're now not living as Am Kadosh, we're living like everybody else?
I think that the bottom line is, do you have a community that is really committed to the wholeness, the shlemut of halakha, and is willing to sacrifice for it? If that community sees a need, then you trust that community.
So let's turn to LGBT then. Let's hypothesize an entire community, right? We don't see it right now, but let's say in 25, 50 years, a whole community of people say, much like Rabbi Greenberg was arguing, these people love each other. We shouldn't be against love. It's certainly better if they're monogamous. So two gay people have monogamous passion for each other. They want to be with each other. They want to get married. They want to express that love sexually. They're not hurting anybody. Let's start invoking meta-legal principles, right? Kavod habriyut, pikuach nefesh, right? There's all talks of, all this talk of suicidality if we don't allow it. So good. I've invoked the meta-legal principles. I've talked about, I've stressed strongly that these are now modern values for the Torah community itself, let's say, hypothetically. What now? Really? So if I follow the lead of all of you, what now is, let's change it. Let's slowly, the Providence history will slowly seep into the law, and eventually, like Rip Van Winkle, will fall asleep, we'll wake up, boom, it's already behind us, and gay sex is fine. I'm not saying one way or the other, but that's where
I think that is what is happening. In other words, you have now the fine line between disgust, Rav Feinstein, who said they're obviously Rashaim, to tolerance, recognizing what can they do they can't overcome, to empathy, feeling understanding for their need not to be alone, to full acceptance. That line is very fine, and once you have a reality, which is happening under our noses, and there's a difference between my generation and a younger generation already, who understands this is muvan me'elav. It's a given. You have communities who are accepting such families. They raise children. These children have to be accepted in religious schools because you're not going to deprive good Jewish children from having a religious education. Their situation in the religious school is not like that of non-Sabbath observing parents whom the principal or the teacher might say, we hope that they're going to be choser b'tshuva, they will do repentance, and telling the children, hoping you'll encourage your parents to keep mitzvot. Whereas with homosexual parents, first of all, the principal can't tell the parents, hide this and don't talk about it, as they will to non-Sabbath observing children. It's out there in the open. And they also can't tell the children, we hope your parents will be choser b'tshuva, and cause a conflict in the family. This reality is already, and these children become normative children, and they are fully observant. This reality is just a game changer. And I don't think if this happens that we will have to look at it with sorrow, because if these people in all the other aspects of their lives remain committed to the Jewish community, then this eventually, in some way or other, will be normative, and a formal solution will be found because there's no way around it.
First, I think we have to, very briefly I'll say, you have to put first the line, not between, like, where is the, between love and the halakha and stuff, but there is a very thick line, not thin line, thick line between, let's say, observing Shabbat and homosexuality. Because people will say, okay, I'm a student in the university, and I need to learn on Shabbat, to study on Shabbat, because otherwise I will fail, and this is immoral. And so what's the difference?
Meaning they have to go to classes and write and stuff like that? Okay.
Like, I know. But then I strongly believe now, I don't know what will happen in the future, but right now, as I see it, and I don't see that something can be changed, that not being Shabbat observant is immoral, because Shabbat is one of the most moral issues in the world. And learning and like going to classes or whatever on Shabbat is something which within society, if society will bring you to it, this is immoral. And even if we don't talk about immoral, moral, it's not a moral issue. Okay, I accept. For some people, it's not a moral issue. This is the word of God. But nobody can convince me or anyone I know that this is what morality is.
I just want to clarify what you're saying. So let me just make sure I know what you're saying. You're saying that for you, Shabbat is such a baseline part of Jewish morality that any attempt to break it in the name of morality is self-contradictory, doesn't work, and you feel that this is not the kind of thing where eventually we will integrate that.
I'll give you an example to prove it even, because on Shabbat, pikuach nefesh doche Shabbat, it's not only pikuach nefesh, but if someone is about to lose a hand, halachically, we're not allowed to desecrate Shabbat. We're not allowed to drive, we don't do, like according to the halacha. But if you see the commentators in our days, they will say that it is permissible. It's okay to, if you are going to lose your hand, not your life, you can go to hospital on Shabbat, because in our days, a hand, like losing a hand, is pikuach nefesh, because you'll be in depression, you'll be depressed, and you might think that there is no value to your life, because to be crippled in our days, it's much worse than in past generations. So you see here that the halacha, when it says that even today, that Shabbat brings something which in people's eyes is immoral, and for them it will bring them not to observe Shabbat and to see Shabbat as something which is cruel, the halacha will take it in consideration. So again, so this is about losing your hand or losing your eye, whatever. So about homosexuality, if I ask anyone, come and see, meet homosexuals, okay? If you have a student, if you have someone, let's go and see around. Nobody will say, just without halacha. People will say, well, I understand this is moral, but the halacha overcome morality. And this is, I cannot accept. That someone will say the halacha overcome morality. And now let's argue, let's talk about it within Bet Midrash.
I just want to understand what you're saying before Tamar speaks. You're saying, when you say overcome, meaning you can't accept the idea that there's nothing wrong with expressing this kind of love, but since the halacha says no, so the halacha is actually mevatel. It's negating something that might be seen, and from any other perspective would be seen as fine. You're saying you can't accept that the halacha does this?
Yeah, I cannot accept.
Meaning, so where does that leave us then? In other words, you're saying that the halacha, if we quote unquote prove that gay love and gay sex is part of modern morality, not like Professor Ross talked about that Rabbi Feinstein saw it as disgusting, but let's say we say there's nothing wrong with it, but the halacha says not allowed. So what are you saying, that we should now change the halacha?
No, I'm not saying it. Again, let's go to the beginning of our conversation here, that what I said is that then when I see something like this, I must say to myself, it cannot be the halacha is making people so miserable. And then I will go back to Bet Midrash and see what can be done to find the halacha, because I will never believe that God said something which will bring people to be cruel to each other, or to have, by the halacha, people can make people miserable. Okay, this is something else. But not the halacha. If the halacha makes not someone, not individuals, but society, a big group of people with the families and like so many people, it will bring them not to be uncomfortable, but it's cruel for them what the halacha will say. So I accept that some people, it's always like this, some people must bear the cruelty of law, okay, but not too many people, and not so many people, and not in an issue which is in our fundamental identity, which is the זהות המינית שלנו, like the sexual orientation of us. So we go back to עולם הלכה and see if really the halacha, we understood it before in a good way, and maybe there's something which was hidden from us, and now we can find it.
I want to be equivocal now and talk from the other side. I'm not 100% sure that what we are undergoing now is a positive thing, and I think that it is good that the halacha is has to pant after the real situation, and that there is a gap between what is happening on the ground and what halakha is going to have to say. Because I don't want to belittle the impact of the sexual revolution that is taking place. And it really is a very drastic cultural revolution for Yahadut altogether. The binary distinction between male and female, thinking binaries altogether, is a very deep-seated principle in our tradition. The difference between Kodesh L'chol, the difference between Tov Ra, the difference between Sheshet Hayamim v'Shabbat, and the difference between male and female. It has such deep-seated grounding in our Jewish thinking that it is not something that we can tamper with lightly. First of all, it gives us, in a system in which we express ourselves religiously through halakha. Halakha needs these strong distinctions between good and bad, male and female, tahor v'tameh, and so forth. And secondly, it's such a deep-seated metaphor for the relationship between God and Israel. And in the Torah, there is it's not only in connection with men and women, but kilaim and shatnez, and not allowing men to dress up as women, the other way around. There is a very deep-seated interest in maintaining binary distinctions, which the homosexual revolution is undermining. And so how we can appropriate that within tradition is a question. And it's something that does have to take place slowly. Even in general society, the idea of two opposites are necessary for the production of human flourishing, for producing the right midot of understanding the need to face the other and to adjust to the other. There are very deep understandings in this whole model of reality. And there have been social experiments in the past in this direction that didn't work. A much smaller example is in the kibbutzim, when they tried to, of Shomer HaTzair, when they tried to disrupt the family unit and have the Bet Yiladim, where children sleep separately and boys and girls take showers together. And in the end, it turned out that it wasn't such a good thing. And so I think the fact that the Poskei Halacha are forced to go slowly is a very good thing. And the fact that there is a disparity between what is happening on the ground and when Halacha catches up is not a bad thing at all.
There's a few things that were said here, so I'm going to just try and cover them. So, first of all, I think that there is an interplay, definitely, between the people and the authorities. I'm not saying there was no interplay at all. Of course, there is an interplay. To my mind, the interplay, the part that the people play is very important. It brings to light, brings to the surface problems, things that are problematic, things that are bothering people, things that are not settling well with what they're experiencing, conflicts, between the Torah and ethics and other things. So obviously bringing those things to light when the poskim are many times not aware that those things are going on is imperative and important, without a doubt. I don't think that means that whenever the people have a significant decision that they're making, go in a certain direction, that means that the poskim will automatically go in that direction as well. And I think, and I'm not trying to say that Rabbi Vilk said this, because I don't think he did, but I think that it also depends many times on the impetus, meaning the reason why people are changing. And number two, it depends also which group, because when we say the people, who do we mean? I mean, at the moment, I would say that 80%, I don't know how many percent are not religious in this country. And they're all Jews, and they're going in a certain direction. Obviously, the poskim will not follow that just because there's a huge group of secular Jews. Of course, we're going to be attentive to that. That's true. We're going to be attentive. Why are so many people secular? What can we do? How can we get closer? Maybe they have a point about certain things that they're not keeping, et cetera, et cetera. There certainly will be an attentiveness, but there won't be just a mass following of poskim, after that trend. Hence I said, obviously it'll depend on the group, right? When you say the people are going in a certain direction, you mean a certain group of people. It depends which the group, etc. Right? A large group of who? Okay. So then, of course, the question is once again who? Okay. So obviously that's true. I would also offer as an example, okay, the Sephardi Masorti traditional, community, which very interestingly has existed for I don't know how many hundreds of years. And they don't keep everything, but they're still part of the community. But they've never asked for acceptance of their way of life as halachic. Meaning no one thinks that going to shul, coming back, making kiddush, and turning on the TV, watching the game, that's all right, yeah? I'm not saying Rav Shlomo Vilk said that. Yeah, he said it's the opposite. Shabbos is sacred. But my point is that there is actually a group of people who live, in a sense, within the Orthodox traditional community who adhere to, let's call it an Orthodox framework, but they never asked to be recognized, never asked for recognition that their way of life is halachic or acceptable, etc. As I said on the panel, I'm not against accepting people into the community who are homosexual. The question is the legitimization of that way of life as halachic. That's a whole different story. So there are two different things over here. There's the practical and there's the principle, once again before, like I said. And one last point about ethics and morality. I kind of agree and disagree at the same time with what Rav Vilk said about, if it's not ethical, I can't countenance it. So it depends. First of all, I agree that we need to kind of like figure out what's moral. But V'asita Yashar V'atovich, the Ramban, Nachmanides trumps as being very significant as a kind of like a guiding principle to interpret other laws, is counterbalanced by Kedoshim to you, which the Ramban also writes is for the opposite side, meaning to usher things that are mutter, to prohibit things that are allowed. Sometimes people say, I want this, and I want that, I want to do this. And he also mentions biot asurot there. He mentions specifically people wanting to sleep with people they're not allowed to sleep with, etc. And sometimes, people need to also, Chazal need to put, balance there. If you want to marry many wives, or you want to do this or that, or spend all day, having sex, etc. Ramban says that you need to put a limit for, etc. So there's definitely a balance to Asita Yashar V'atov in Kedoshim to you, and that's also a moral limit, meaning an ethics that we're supposed to learn. And the last thing I want to say, and then I'm finished, which is that I also don't want to believe that the Torah is immoral. And it would also be difficult for me to believe that the Torah says something that is unethical. But many times I believe that we need to put our ethics on hold to see if we can learn something from the Torah about what is or isn't ethical. So for example, abortion. So there, white people are pro-life or pro-choice. I can see from a pure ethical perspective, I can kind of maybe see both sides. But the Torah has a stance on that position. And while people might have ethical feelings one way or another, I may decide to learn my ethics from the position that the Torah takes. Sure, there will be poskim who say this or say that, 100%. There'll be disagreements about what that is, although I don't know any poskim who says that abortion is just nothing. In other words, no problem whatsoever in any situation. I don't know anyone who says that, but because as if the fetus is nothing, it's not even a person in any way, shape, or form. I don't know anyone who says that statement. So I definitely think that we need to feel the Torah is moral, but we also should sometimes learn what morality is from the Torah itself.
Here we get into a deep theological question. Does the Torah really have a fixed moral stance, or even a moral stance? Or are we reading into the Torah what we think the Torah ought to be saying? I think the Torah in various generations has been understood in various ways, and even the original text of the Torah can be understood as having been developed in various ways. So that whole notion of the Torah having a very fixed view on things, and all we need to do is look there and discover it, is perhaps a modern idea that is being debunked in our postmodern reality. And we have different ways of reading the Torah today, understanding perhaps that how a text is read has to do with the previous interests and biases and cultural conditioning of the reader, including the Torah itself.
Just one point to that, which is I totally agree with that. The only thing I wanted to say just to that was that I completely agree with that, which is why I believe that any practical position is a merger of halacha and machshava, because machshava is malleable and changes. People change, sensitivities change, and people read the Torah every generation differently. I think the methodology of the halacha is there to center us and ground us so that there is a continuation, a tradition, so that we are connected to what came before, and that way it continues.
Right, but I see a fundamental tension here, really, that I felt 3 weeks ago and I feel it now, which is that if we take the point of view of text and interpretation, right, which is actually my training. My training is in English literature. So in literature, especially in French literary theory of the 70s and 80s, what you learn is that every text deconstructs itself, that language is innately slippery. It's not like you apply something to it that destabilizes it, but the language inherently is unstable. And frankly, I see that in the Gemara all the time, right, where language is taken for a ride well beyond what I might have thought of creatively. So aren't we really, again, returning to the issue of authority? In other words, we can talk here about text and interpretation, but it then comes down to who gets to decide what interpretation is. Even the most radical interpretation becomes something that gets absorbed in Jewish tradition if the right people at the right time said it. There's something inherently strange about that, though, because we're actually trying to merge two principles that don't merge. One is that texts always lend themselves to interpretation, whoever you are. And the other is we're actually going to seal off the border of that interpretation based on who said it and when. Just to rehearse Rabbi Greenberg's position just for a moment. So one of the things that Rabbi Greenberg talks about in his book endlessly is maybe we can look at those original verses in Vayikra and elsewhere and historicize them and contextualize them and talk about that the rabbis didn't know about monogamous gay love. Truth is, nobody in the ancient world knew about this, right? And sexuality was completely fluid in Greece and Rome. We have a completely new paradigm. Why should we apply old interpretive methods that are 2,000 years old to cultural contexts that didn't exist, right? But if the trump card is always going to be, when I say that, yes, but it's Chazal, and they have authority, so now the rock has hit the hard place. We've made an argument, perhaps a strong argument, that contextually, interpretively, we're in a new situation completely. But if we keep saying we return to the halakha of the authority of those who came before, you're never going to put the round hole, the square peg in the round hole, ever. You're going to force it at that point. Where does that leave us?
First of all, I don't think that our attitude towards Chazal is only based on authority, because there are another two things that we have to add into the picture, to the puzzle. One is obviously authority, the second is appreciation, and the third is tradition. And in a sense, when authority is, they said, this is they were authorized, I'm not allowed to dispute them, and that's it. The second thing is that they were closer to Har Sinai, they were closer to Dvar Hashem, they still had prophets, some of them among them, and they were able to listen to the words of God better than I can. And this is something, it's not about authority just because, like, I don't know, previous generation said something. It's also because I think that they were closer to Hashem. And the third thing is respect, which means that when I see what they said and read and learn, I see that they were, I don't know, like genius is something very shallow to we say geonim for some of them, but still they understood the depth of human nature and society, and they understood the way how to approach God. But the problem is that they understood it in a context which is a different context than mine. So then what I have to do is to take their words the halacha until Shulchan Aruch or even later generations, and see how can I take from it the ideas, the concepts that, this is a very halachic way to say that what would have happened if I'll bring Rabbi Akiva, what would have, if he lived today, what would have he said? What would he said? Because someone asked me the Rambam when I married my wife is a physician, and back then 35 years ago, it was not acceptable for a religious woman to go to and learn to become a doctor. And someone asked me, what do you think the Rambam would have said if he was here now? And I said, well, Rambam was also a physician. So, and no Rav Haredi will tell his Talmidim that to be a physician is something that you should add into your Limud Torah. So, I'm sure that Chazal, let's start. I'll give you an example, one very short example about Reshut HaRabim, the public arena, okay, which is a very significant importance about Hilchot Shabbat. But in our days, to open a computer in your room is much more Reshut HaRabim than to go out, because my daughter has 600 friends in Facebook, on her Facebook. So this is Reshut HaRabim, and the cautious about being there is much more important for me than being outside. And to open a computer, nobody would to use computer on Shabbat, besides the rules of electricity and stuff, maybe it's Reshut HaRabim. They don't want you to be part of Reshut HaRabim and to go to the internet. It's a different concept they take from Chazal, from the idea of being within and not being outside, but inside, that opening a computer is being outside, in my eyes. So I'm trying to apply the concept, the ideas into modern life, and all I see about computer on Shabbat is about electricity, whether it's to press save or not save, or all kinds of, for me it's Reshut HaRabim. So this is something that I see, the ideas of Chazal, and I'm trying to bring them up and bring them down into my own life. But as is, nobody lives like this anymore. Nobody lives in Chazal's time. Even the Haredim, nobody. They can say that everything is the same. But obviously, if Rabbi Akiva was here now, he was not able to understand anything that's been said here or in any yeshiva, even in Ponevezh.
So let's go back to what Yoni said before. I like the phrase test case, right? So we have homosexuality as a test case, and you even wrote a long piece in Hebrew, basically that language. When we look at, we all know people, right? I have students, I have friends, the people who sponsored this program, right? Gay people, loving people. So I don't recognize the people I know in the portraits of gay sex, let's say in Greek writing and Roman writing and even in Talmudic writing. So that's a fact. And I'm trying to understand from you, because you said if there's a groundswell of people, not just individuals, a groundswell of people who believe like something is hurting them, etc., we have to go back to Olam HaHalacha and look at it. Good. So I go back to Olam HaHalacha and I look at it. So are you saying that I'm now going to look at it, bringing all of my historical contextual information, and I'm going to eventually change the law because the people who live now and practice that lifestyle are not the same? You're not saying that.
No, what actually are you? Changing the law. I will never use the term changing the law.
So tachlis, where does it mean?
Not because I'm trying to be politically correct or I'm afraid of what people will say about me. I'm not saying, I will never use the term changing the halacha. Never. Not because I'm afraid of someone. I'm not afraid. It's just because I think it's not changing the halacha. It's making, to put the halacha in a certain place, because obviously, like in heterosexual sex, there are many things that are abomination. And I will say it's abomination, whether it's heterosexual or monosexual sex. So when I put it in a frame that will say, okay, let's see what was the world of Chazal and what is the way that monosexual engagement took place, and I see what they meant abomination, and nowadays it's the same. In many places, in many cases, the way the parade, the Pride Parade or whatever, some of it is abomination.
You're talking about San Francisco, 1970s,
exactly.
Promiscuous sex.
Yeah.
That reminds you of the abomination.
Exactly, but
right.
when they try to establish something else, something new, something which is, maybe I feel uncomfortable because I'm not used to it, and that's not my way. And in a sense, I think that the breaking of the sexual identity, like all kinds of sexual identities, it's just maybe eventually we're talking about 2-3%, 4% of the people. Most people live, men and women. We're not trying to break everything. I'm not going now to Judith Butler. Let's break everything and make us amini, with no sex, with no gender. I'm not saying it. And people are healthier than postmodern theories. And in a sense, most people will live from now on. And the problem is that when we make it so an issue, we bring people closer to it. People are trying to be curious. And even those who are so much further away from it are becoming more and more curious about it now. And even if because probably, I don't know, if you take ancient Greek, probably everybody has the ability to be attracted to his own sex. But if because they made it into a ideology to be attracted to the same sex between men. We don't make it into ideology. Nobody is making it. Nobody in the healthy, common sense world. Nobody is making it ideology. They're making for people, and it's not a new phenomena that people are being attracted to their own same sex. And maybe it's between 2 and 4% of the population, and the numbers I don't think change from Chazal's time to our time. Just it's the way how they interact with each other. So I can put the new interaction in a different framework than the halakha, and the halakha in a different okimta, like to put it in a framework, a different framework, and then I can say this is abomination. This is what the halakha meant, but not this, because this is anus rachmana patre, because this is pikuach nefesh, because this is not the kind of this is not mishkavei isha. This is not what the halakha meant mishkavei isha. I have all kinds of methods.
Okay, I want to reiterate what you are saying, and to go back to your question regarding Steve Greenberg, who suggests going back to historical reasons, and is halakha plastiline? Halakha is not plastiline, it's a language game. It has its own grammar and its own rules, and sometimes we can undermine certain decisions using a veneer of rhetoric, and I'm not saying this cynically. This is part of the game, and the game itself is so rich in various voices in tradition and various patentim in which you can overcome certain strictures. And the question which patent you use has to do also with context and the viability of the particular interpretation that you are suggesting. But I think that in general, there is a huge amount of wiggle room in the interpretive tradition, even using the grammatical rules that we have.
So would you say, just briefly, would you say then that modern halachists or legalists, part of the problem may not be fundamental, it may be just that they're not availing themselves enough of this toolbox?
Yes, and also because they do not have enough of a consensus yet within the community. If they go out on a limb, they may lose all their political stance if they go out on a limb before the general consensus of the community that listens to them is ready to hear that kind of psak.
Can you just address the irony here that you've actually talked about in writing, right?
Yeah.
The classicist Francis Cornford talking about the fact that if we wait for the first time, if we're always deferring to the fact that it hasn't been done before, there'll never be a first time. How do you overcome that? It's a catch-22, basically, what you're
There's
talking about.
always a gap. There's always a gap. And in that gap, things work out on the ground. If people who are committed to this change on the ground are equally committed to the ground rules of halakha and demonstrate this commitment by staying within the community with all the pain and all the discomfort and all the lack of certainty, they are what enable eventually the posek to come out using the wiggle room that is really inherently there.
Well, there's a measure of courage here that we're talking
There's
about.
certainly a measure. Is
right?
always a measure of courage which is demanded in liminal situations, and this isn't the first liminal situation. Sometimes the liminal situations are imposed upon us. Sometimes it is something subjective, but you always take chances.
So by liminal, you mean the seam between the old and the new. Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And between what's approved and what's not yet approved, yet you feel in your guts has to be approved. And there will never be complete consensus about this. And we've lived for 2,000 years with different communities having different opinions. And so long as there's some sort of a general commitment and they can see each other as brothers and sisters, even sometimes vying for authority amongst themselves, that will continue. We will never have a total consensus about it.
Yeah, something you said struck me about theological language and how we assess human beings. Like all of you, both 3 weeks ago and now, it's perfectly obvious that everybody here invokes words like compassion, empathy, I'm not judging you, God judges you, etc. Right? At the same time, you, a number of times in this conversation, use the word sin, right? I think you're sinning, of course, not for me to judge you, and knowing you personally, I know you wouldn't. It's not even part of the conversation that you would insult this person. But I'm interested in another tack here, which is, what happens to the status of sin metaphysically? In other words, we say that this is a sin until it's now not a sin, right? Because we've tweaked something legal. And I'm trying to understand the interplay here between the metaphysics. I mean, I'm not a big metaphysician, neither in conviction nor practice, but the interplay between suddenly saying something's okay now, right? I think, when you speak to, let's say, certain Haredim, so they will say, just because you say it's okay doesn't mean it's not like mamash avera, and a sin, and they'll be onish, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we change the status of acts theologically? How do we say that suddenly this is okay?
Well, first of all, I think there is a huge difference between saying in English sin and in Hebrew chet. Because I'm not sure, because I was never an English speaker, but for someone who grew up in Europe or in a Muslim or in a Christian country, when you say sin, you imagine Lucifer with a sickle in his hand, looking for, like, with his blood or whatever from his mouth, from his teeth. To say chet in Hebrew, it's something much softer. To commit a chet is not like to commit a sin.
To miss the target, so to speak.
It's the first sinner, according to the Midrash, is Hashem himself, because he created earth, heaven and the earth, and he asked the earth to bring up etz pri oseh pri, and the earth didn't bring up what Hashem wanted. And if we take sin as something that you wanted something and it didn't happen, so Hashem also is a sinner. And like Chazal says, that when we bring the korban, the sacrifice of Rosh Chodesh, aviu alai kapara, we bring it as a kapara, as a redemption for the sin of God, that he had to make the women smaller than men, or the levana, the moon smaller. So in a sense, sin is something which is, in my eyes, much softer. And if I'm trying to do something, okay, I'm a sin. Everybody in the world is sin. And tzaddik ba'aretz, there aren't any righteous people that never sinned. And actually, like what I grew up on with my rabbanim, is that tzaddik gamur is gamur, is finished, and nobody wants to be finished. So we all want to grow up. We want to, and sin is something that gives you future. And if you live sinful life, is something horrible. But if you live life with chataim, is something that we all share.
But isn't the language there even mistake language? You're telling them your sex, your love,
I'm saying
it's
that there is a mistake here, because this is not the way of nature. Nature, like the ברירת המחדל, the default of nature is men and women. This is the majority of people. And you're not the default of nature. Okay, not the default of God, but this is how God created you, because God hates world of just defaults. He wants the world to be more.
Wait, so stop right there, right? So God created you gay.
Exactly.
So God created you gay.
He didn't create you gay. I don't believe in it. I believe that God made the possibility of gayness, or
Right,
of being gay in the world, and someone, it happened to him. I don't think that there is ashgacha pratit in a sense that God gives him a nisayon.
I'm not talking about predetermined, but I'm saying within the range of inclination, your set of inclinations was much more towards the homosexual side. So wouldn't it be normal for a person to say, given that that's your theology, God made you with those predilections and they're this way, so I'm just acting on what God gave me. Now I'm looking up and you're telling me I'm doing mistaken things.
Yeah.
Doesn't that seem self-contradictory to you?
No, I'm not, because I'm not obliged to nature. I'm obliged to halacha, and then the halacha is for the majority of people. And if someone is mamzer, if someone is he's not to be blamed. The halacha said that he's mamzer, but the poskim will always, nobody will argue that will try, beside the Rabbanut Rashit Israel, unfortunately, will try and make him not mamzer because they see it as an immoral thing. And the poskim throughout the generations, even in our days, will do any effort to not to know that he is mamzer, to bring doubts within it. So we understand that the halacha is saying something which is very deep and which is very important about the crucial importance of loyalty within the family and the prices of it. But we have eventually, at the end of the day, we have to make the prices not too half. Okay, because this is what the poskim are trying to do.
Let me run you back here. So, loyalty within the family, meaning the usual family structure. We don't want you outside of that family structure. We want you to have natural reproductive capability. Okay, so let's say we say 4%, 5%, whatever the percentage is, of the public has a non-pathological predilection for same-sex attraction. Why doesn't the halakha then say, I understand what the default natural position is, and I understand the values that we want to inculcate on a basic scale, but clearly we have this non-pathological minority who this is their way of expressing themselves. And just to address something you talked about before, and it's not like they're aberrant on holiness, so we don't want them committing adultery and so on, because they still have, right, the ability in straight sex to have sex with somebody, right? In other words, when religious people, rehearse this argument of, well, I'm married and I can't commit adultery, it's not analogous argumentation because you can have sex with someone, right? So let's throw that argument out. So the truth of this person's sexual orientation is this is who I can have sex with. So if I'm saying to them, well, it's not natural, it's not this, it's not that, tachlis, are you saying they need to sacrifice themselves for the larger value system of the halakha, or do what you do but do it in private? Or, in other words, I'm trying to pin down, where do we go here? No, there's gay sex, right? And we say there's a minority and it's in them. It's not, we're not going to change them. We're not going to, right? What do we do now? I want to understand, from your point of view.
So what I'm saying is very simple. What I'm saying, well, I'll put it in maybe I'll give a schedule, okay, of what we do. First of all, I think we say that even if you're a sinner, that's the first step. Even if you're a sinner, according to the halakha, I'm also a sinner. And your sin might be bigger or whatever. I can't measure sins. But still, you can be religious without this element. Okay, this is something that you say, okay, I cannot keep. Okay. The second step is to have compassion. The third step will be bringing it into the halakha. And the fourth step will be eventually to find ways how the halakha can make sure that you will have a proper life without what we will decide is abomination within his life. It will take time. I agree with Professor Ross, with Rabbanit Ross, I think it's better, Rebbitzin Ross. Because I think it's we have to do it in steps, and we have to do it very gently, and we don't have not because I'm afraid of public, just because I'm afraid of public opinion, but because I'm afraid of the halakha. I want to be sure that my steps are correct.
But you're saying this is where you think the halacha should go on LGBT?
No, I'm not saying anything. I'm saying that let's see what will happen. But I will if I'll see around me so many of my students who are approaching me and say, I am lesbians or homosexuals or trans, and for 20 years now I'm dealing with it, and I see very, very good students who wants to be of the Hashem and they cannot. And I'm saying, you know what, be Oved Hashem. And I always quote Hermione in Harry Potter. Can I say something? Hermione said once, when the kids did something, she said that it's so awful what you did, we might have been dead, or even worse, being expelled from school. And this is so deep, the idea of I don't want to, I'm telling them, it's better to die than to live halakha, to live the Torah, to live the world of Torah. And because being expelled, or from your own will even, of the world of Torah is worse than death. And then let's talk. And this is the commitment. The commitment to Hashem is so strong that they say, I'm willing to stand in front of God with my sins and look him in the eyes. It's something very strong for them. And I think, like I said to my students in Midrashet Lindenbaum or any other place, or my student, if we want the revolution of women learning Torah to succeed, you have to do Mesirut Nefesh. You have to be Mesirut Nefesh on it. Like my wife, when she wanted to go to medicine, she did Mesirut Nefesh on it.
Self-sacrifice.
Self-sacrifice. And if you'll stay and learn and you grow up family which will be committed to Torah, with the revolution, so everybody will say, that's the right way of Torah. And in a sense, I think that this is what will happen. If we will have Talmidot Chachamim, we'll have that will rule, that will have strong voice of Torah, not of feminism, of Torah, then feminism will grow. But if we will have people who have a very strong voice of feminism, no religious feminism will move even one step.
Wait, so let me ask you a personal question then. All right? Because I'm trying to unpack this. You're dividing between a moral stance in a way and what halacha will say. And I'm trying to understand, do you have a position on this internally morally, or is your position simply quoting halachic language? I'll make it clear. I look at homosexuality as a modern person, and I say, there's various ways I can articulate this. I can say, I personally see nothing wrong with it, but Nebuch, the halakha says no.
No, I'm not saying there's nothing wrong about it.
Or I can say,
it's not very
the halakha
simple.
says it's wrong, and I actually also think it's wrong. But what I'm trying to understand from you is, you said, well, maybe we'll go along, we'll see how it goes. Does that mean that if it gets changed in whatever way it gets changed, that you suddenly flip the sides of the moral line, like beforehand, because the halakha said no, you said no?
No.
So how does it work then?
Because when I'm talking now, I'm not saying that homosexuality is a moral thing. I'm saying that some of it, I see it as a moral thing, and some of it is not. For example, I'll give you now, immoral, sorry.
Okay.
Because if you take now the question of surrogate mothers, okay, this is immoral issue. And unlike unhealthy women that use surrogate mothers, all homosexuals who wants to have kids, they need surrogate mothers.
Or adoption.
And I think, or adoption. But surrogate mother, I think it's an immoral thing. As a society, I think whether it's men or women, like for lesbians or for unhealthy people or barren women or heterosexuals, I think it's an immoral thing to use surrogate mothers. But the problem is to understand that we need it in our society. So if it's only barren women who cannot have kids, so it's 100 surrogate mothers in Israel. This is the numbers now. So I'm accepting it because we will find 100 women who will do it just as I don't know, like...
You're saying it's a need that they can't get around? And
no, and the women who will do it will be women who do it from goodwill and not because they have to or because they need money. They won't be used, but if we take all the homosexuals in consideration, the numbers will get much higher, and I think this is a problem that we have to face now and say, listen, if you don't want, maybe, I don't know, if this is what you choose, you cannot use others to I'm saying it. I'm not saying
Right,
it's
so tie
forbidden.
this
I'm
back
saying
into
that
my
this
question.
it's a consideration. So what I'm saying is that we have like the thin line. We didn't draw it yet. I don't know what is right and what is wrong. I know that we have to see, but we have to see and we have to look, but without ignoring the pain, without ignoring the fact that people are in pain. People are, for centuries, they were pushed aside to the
margins.
Margins of society, and what's in the margins was bad. And we say this is what they are because we pushed them to there, like women. This is what we do. We pushed women aside, and they didn't know anything. So we say people know nothing. Women know nothing, and homosexuals are bad. But I want them within society, and then let's discuss. Let's see what is the line. I'm not drawing it now. I'm not saying that we have to push now. I'm just saying patience, compassion, and discussions. And what we do now is most of the Rabbanim are not willing to discuss. Most of the gays, because nobody's discussing, they are shouting, and we'll have demonstrations instead. So nothing will come out of it. No, we cannot draw any lines because it's all about shoutings. It's about political influence, and it's not about the essence of it. Nobody talks about the deep ideas and the deep understanding of morality and compassion, and instead we talk about like money and breaking rules and external things instead of internal things.
Okay, so what I wanted to ask you is the same question, right? In other words, I'm trying to understand here, when we think about moral issues in the modern day, do we have stances that we hold internally? Because everybody, no matter what we want to say, no matter how much fidelity we have to the law, each of us internally has a sense. So do we say that sense is overridden by what the law tells us? Right? I'm going to repeat the models. I think something is right or wrong. The law says differently. I still personally believe it's right or wrong, but I will negate my will to the law's will. I'm not actually accepting the law's morality necessarily, but I will surrender to it. Or I had a view, but actually I'm changing my view now because the law has told me this is a wrong thing. And you know what? I'm going to go with not just with the law's practical outcome, but with the law's moral outcome, that the law is telling me X, Y, and Z. Now, you personally, let's say you looked at the LGBT issue. The law says X right now. The law says Y in 30 years from now or 100 years from now. Does that mean you'd actually flip your moral stance?
There are two things over here, and it's complicated. I'm not sure that this is the time for me to go into a whole philosophical thing. But in short, all right, there is definitely, and I'm sure Professor Ross has a lot to say about this, but there's definitely a question that many authorities dealt with over the years of the kind of like the relationship between what the rabbis say and what the Torah says, what the written word and what the Torah Shebe'al Peh actually says. Because, for example, let's take a very, very easy example. When God says, not to cook a calf in its mother's milk, and I decide whether that includes chicken or it doesn't include chicken, et cetera, right? I mean, in the Gemara, you can find 3 different opinions on that. And at the end of the day, God meant something, no? I mean, he didn't write a verse and said, I'm leaving this open. Yeah, he meant something. So which one did he supposedly mean?
What does that mean, he meant something?
Well, supposedly, when he wrote that verse, when he dictated that verse, he meant for it to include yes or no.
And how is what he meant accessible?
Well, that's the point. That's exactly my point. That either it is or it isn't accessible, and that's really the question. So my answer to that, okay, I'm making this short, okay, which I believe is the answer that the Ran, Rabbeinu Nissim, gives in his drashot, in his book. I think that the answer to that question is, and this I think also is somewhere in Rabbi Kook, I'm sure you can quote the exact passage, that the halacha, the straight up halacha, meaning the practical halacha, is a very, very small sliver of God's will. Meaning what we practically do is not at all encompassing of what God meant. So we can decide, halacha kebeit Shammai or halacha kebeit Hillel, from a principle perspective, elu va'elu divrei Elokim chaim, they are both words of the living God, but halacha kebeit Hillel, but the practical application will be like a certain opinion. Not because that's the truth in all its encompassing nature. The truth is much greater. God's truth about the world, about what we're supposed to do, what counts, so to speak, as a good or bad act is much greater than the practical thing that we're going to do. But what we're going to do has been decided to be the best way that we can implement
So
God's word.
without naming anything, do you ever have a sense sometimes that, in fact, the ruling as it stands is 100% counter to your view of truth?
If you're asking whether I sometimes read, for example, a disagreement and see that all the people went a certain way, and I'm like, but obviously Rabbi Akiva's right.
Right. I'm not actually asking about the methodology. I'm talking about your internal moral compass.
Saying that I feel like that person's right, even though halacha was not like him. That posek was correct, that issue. If you're asking me whether I've ever encountered a situation where everyone has gone a certain way, meaning the entire corpus of halacha has gone a certain way, and I feel differently, I don't remember a specific instance.
And
like
what
that.
about LGBT?
About the LGBT issue. So this is the second issue, okay? About the LGBT issue, and you could say that this is my way of like a defense mechanism. First of all, I greatly agree with what Vilk said on that in terms of patience. I do agree with that general motto. And I believe that it's the motto of my Rosh Hashiva, Rav Rabinovich as well, who kind of like says, you don't have to talk about it so much, you don't have to shout about it so much, let things play out kind of a thing. I believe that to some, I'm not saying about this specifically that I spoke to him, but I know in general he has a similar model that he discusses. But in this specific instance, I disentangle the moral issue from the halachic issue. And the way that I do that is by discussing feelings separately than the act. In other words, I do believe that two men loving each other is not a bad thing. Like David and Yonatan, even though I don't think they were homosexuals at all, but they could have had a very, very strong love towards each other. And I don't think that two men having a strong love is what the Torah is against. I don't think the Torah is legislating against love, which is how it's portrayed in order to, I think, to some extent, demonize what the Torah is saying. I don't think that's what the Torah is saying at all. The Torah is talking about a specific act, and it is definitely prohibiting that act. I also think that it's the reason why the Torah discusses homosexuality and not lesbianism, because it's not talking about love as much as it's talking about a specific act with a specific ramification or conclusion. So while I am aware that telling gay people that they cannot have gay sex is going to cause them pain and strife, I'm not denying that fact, but I don't think the Torah is legislating against a feeling. It is legislating against an act.
But in real life, we act on our feelings, right? That's how we live. We have feelings and we express them. We express them erotically and we express them in a variety of ways. So if we say to that person, you're expressing your feelings, feeling it is fine, acting on it is wrong. Is acting on it wrong because I think it's wrong? Or because a text has told me, no, you don't do that? That's what it comes down to. That's what I'm trying to understand. Like if this text wasn't there, would we think this was wrong?
It's very hard to answer a what if.
True.
But if you're asking me, if someone asks me why I was wrong, I do think that there is something that I could say to explain it, but mostly I would just say it's the verse. Yes, mostly I would say that it's the verse.
Okay. Which of course opens up, we haven't even discussed lesbianism, but of course opens up a lot more room since there's nothing explicit. I wanted to finish our conversation by talking about something that I really wanted to talk about 3 weeks ago, but time ran out, which is, you want to add something? Go ahead.
It's a big thing, so I don't know if we're going to...
Big thing?
Yeah.
I'd need to know the big thing before the big thing happens,
Yeah,
but anyway, you give me a hint of the big thing.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to do.
Okay.
This whole talk of what God wanted, I have a much more radical view of metaphysics. And I think that what God wanted is what we think should be. That metaphysical talk is really normative talk in disguise. And it's given metaphysical status because we want to grant it verbally the utmost importance. So when you ask that question of Yoni, what do you really think inside vis-a-vis the halacha? When I have my metaphysical stance and still maintain or want to maintain myself as an Orthodox Jew, I will be committed to the words of the Torah and to the rules of the halachic game, but I will perhaps feel less inhibited in terms of maneuvering within the rules, because I don't think that I am really replicating something that came from above, but I'm trying within those rules to express what I believe is the best way to behave.
But does that not create cognitive dissonance for you and other forms of dissonance?
Explain.
Well, look, I mean, you're arguing against any kind of ontological correspondence between law and metaphysics.
Yes,
so
it's like
language that reflects humans' guess, almost speculation about what the good is.
But I value that way of looking at things because A, it is my tradition. B, it is a very wealthy and a provenly, I don't say absolutely good, but a way that I trust in, and it is the way Jewish people do things, and I am a Jew. So it's my internal reflex to do things that way. Do I think it's the only way? Do I think that even the term God in my theology is a tool to grasp something that is beyond will and beyond distinctions, and there are various other concepts of God around in the world, and my identity with this conception of God as commanding and as of bringing, deciding certain things are right and certain things are wrong, are a function of my being part of that tradition, but I don't claim for them absolute absolute status.
And that leaves us with two possibilities,
But
right?
I live as if it's absolute status.
For reasons that
Have to do with identity, tradition, faith in that tradition.
right. So where does the word truth? He says very, very, very quietly. Where does this enter in?
Beyond truth.
Beyond truth. So it's not tautological, I assume, for you. Like the way you said it there was like, we do it because we do it, because this is what Jews do, which I never liked tautological arguments.
Yeah.
So they must refer to something good outside of them. So you're
Yes.
saying it's a good moral system. So I've heard this argument many times.
Yeah.
This is really Maimonides, one of his main arguments in the guide, is he does almost what I call a stalemate theory. Like, if I can't prove the metaphysics, we'll defer to the idea that this is the best way of life. My point, though, is in a modern context, and this conversation is really
I think, by the way,
contemporary.
we're in a more radical place
Right.
than the Rambam.
No, much
Rambam,
more radical.
yeah.
In other words, what if I demur? In other words, no, I don't actually think it's the best way of life on a number of
Well,
issues like this one. So where do I go now?
You're a free person, and you'll have to decide. That's the modern condition. We are free, and it's more a matter of choice than a belief that something was imposed upon me from up above with a clean voice that I can hear.
I'll just say one more thing. How does a free person reconcile a communal commitment? In other words, because that's part of what's going on here. What we're talking about is that. When you think about religion, you have people whose relationship with religion is pragmatic, either quite consciously pragmatic, right? They don't necessarily invest in beliefs, but they like the way of life. Or people who are believers, they believe it, they haven't probed too closely at the sort of metaphysics of it.
I don't think it's cut and dried, those categories.
They bleed into each other.
Yeah.
But my point here is that if you're going with the point of view that seems somewhat Maimonidean in the guide, which is that we do the system because it's really the best system. Now, if you reach a point in modernity, postmodernity, where that argument is flagging, it's not as strong an argument as it used to be, because you begin to see things that are really troubling you on a core level with the tradition, women, LGBT, whatever your issue is. So now if you can't recoup it from the point of view of saying it's the best system now, so does that mean we have to go back to truth, right? Realize like a lot of outreach did this. A lot of outreach said, the outreach movement in the 70s went
Look,
into actually trying to prove it on a truth level. I think that was actually a colossal failure, but that's for another time.
We have internal language to try and develop a narrative that, as far as possible, will jibe with truth. For example, the narrative that I've developed regarding feminism is that revelation appears also in historical context and not only in the words of the Torah, and that how the Torah should be read, it is part of God's hand, that he thrusts us in new situations so that the Torah has to be read differently. But ultimately, I know that this is an internal narrative, and I can try and tweak it as much as possible. So all sorts of other internal narratives, such as divine providence, that God is also always watching over me or the Jewish people. And when things go wrong, I can say, it's epistemological shortcoming on my part. I don't really know. God's intention was other than what I think it was, or I will be rewarded in the future for something bad in the past. But these are all, at the end of the day, internal narratives that are optional, and try and make the system that I've accepted as palatable as possible in a belief way. But I know that in the end, truly, all my metaphysical statements are filtered through human understandings, and they're not dropping down from heaven.
So, but in your system then, are all the conclusions private? Here's what I mean. I
No.
return to the question I said before, which is how do we delineate the line between a kind of God's hand in history, the Torah is now being revealed through new contexts, and to put it crudely, the corruption of modernity, right? Who makes the decision which is which? Is it a private conclusion?
No.
Is it a communal conclusion?
I think it's a communal.
How do communities are filled with their own biases, their own flow?
True.
Why do they get to decide this is this and not this? This is God and not corruption. This is corruption and not God.
Because
on what
we
basis
always
is that conclusion made?
Because it's not a matter of, we always live in a context, and especially being a Jew, it's very difficult to be a Jew privately, and so that we are influenced and also guided by the community in whose values and whose understanding of Torah we trust.
So if somebody from the Olam HaCharediyut, right,
Yeah.
were to come to you, I'm sure they have, and they were to say to you, the notion that you think that contemporary feminism and Jewish, female Jewish learning of a certain kind is part of the providential unfolding of God is an absolutely corrupt statement on its face, and you have become victim to modern trends. What would you respond to that?
Look at the women around me. Look at their degree of Mesirut Nefesh to the Torah and its values. Look at their commitment to the Jewish way of life. Look what they're producing in terms of greater Yirat Shamayim, greater interest in observing halakha. And I vouch for the product.
So it's a results-based theology in a sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
If it serves somehow, and I won't denigrate their understanding as well. There are, in other words, I think, as I said before, that various communities can live side by side with a much looser kind of commitment that joins them, and there's space for the Haredi woman who davens 3 times a day inside her home and sees her whole value in producing a Talmid Chacham. That's also, that is Mekadem Yiddishkeit, and she feels at one with it. That's also all right.
So less kind of Am Yisrael, more a confederation of states, Israel? Okay, you wanted to say it before.
Well, now it became too big. So, no, I'm not going, no, I'm saying that the topic is way too big from talking about it now for me. I'll just say that what Professor Ross actually is putting us is in between Sinai, which was imposed on us, and Shushan and Esther Megillah Purim, where what Chazal are saying that we accepted it. And the question is, are we Jewish because we're free to choose it, and then it must give us freedom, it must give us a proper way of life, or is it Sinai, which was imposed on us and we ask no questions about it? Because otherwise the mountain will fall upon us.
I think even the decision whether it's kimu v'kiblu or whether how kagigit is also our decision.
Of course, yeah. So I'm not judging. I'm just saying that if, well, what I understand is that you put yourself more in Megillat Esther, maybe because it's a feminist Megillah. And for me, I feel most of my life, my religious life, in Sinai. Because I'm not trying to, my first question is not whether I identify with what I do, but am I keeping the halakha? That's it. That's my first, initially, that's my approach. And then I ask and it's a very difficult question, a very dangerous question, what was exactly being said in Sinai? And then I put myself in and say, okay, let me listen to the voices throughout history that came up from Sinai and from the Sanhedrin, and to see what does it mean for me. Now the question, why is it a dangerous question? Because then I might go to my comfort zone and say, let's make the halakha comfortable that I will live in the halakha can, like you mentioned before, Yoni mentioned Ramban. Ramban in Kedoshim Tiyu said then Naval Birshut HaTorah. He also said then that if you don't do Yashar ve'atov, you can't be Kadosh. So I'm asking myself, if I'm obliged to Sinai, is it because I feel comfortable? Is it because it's moral? Is it because it's my will, or is it a greater will? And I think it's a greater will. But then I ask, when I see something that the greater will brings into the world, immorality or something, or cruelty, then I say it cannot be. Not because I feel for him or for myself, but because I feel for the Shekhinah, for God, because I think that it's Chilul Hashem, that this is what the words of God bring into the world. So my approach is completely out of, it's not a humanistic way of thinking. It's not like, I'm not thinking about, when I see someone who is Chiloni, who is secular, I feel also compassion. I feel sorry for him, that he misses so much, that he's a sinner. And I don't think that my feeling towards him will bring me closer to him, or will give him permission to be such. I hate no one, but I think that it's a way of living. I can accept it or not, but I think I feel.
You don't feel it's patronizing or condescending to feel
patronizing. What's wrong with being? I think that I think that I'm closer to Hashem. That's it. I'm not. I know that I'm giving it space. I'm not trying to change him. But I will never accept it, okay? Because again, so and the meaning that I cannot accept it doesn't mean that I have to hate him or not to being able to live with him. But in the same way, I can say that in the deeper way of understanding of Torah for me is to live inside it and be very cautious that it will be always pure. And it will be always good, because if it's not, it's something that will bring eventually the desecration of the name of God. And this is the main problem of halakha. Never. Chilul Hashem, desecration of the name of God, is the worst sin. And I don't want to be a sinner, but bringing to the world the words of God in a cruel way, in a bad manner way.
I think I live in a world of much greater doubt than any of you, because my feeling day to day, moment to moment, is I could be completely wrong. And one of the reasons I don't pity you is because who knows where the real line is drawn here. I could be doing things and believing in things that are really complete delusion. They may have good effects, meaning they turn me into a moral being better than I might have been, but my theology could be completely skewed or non-existent. So who am I to say that what you're doing is right or wrong? That the issue is that we have to find a kind of common language for morality. So obviously it can't just be helter-skelter. So we come to some sort of communal consensus about certain kinds of things, but I don't know on the level existentially of who's living the right way, how to judge that. That's just me. Thank you all very, very much.